This is the first episode I've recorded since the passing of my good friend Geoffrey Thomas of Daily Airline News, where I was Geoffrey's co-host. Next week, a number of us will publish a special tribute to Geoffrey. Today's episode is, as promised, about Qantas Flight 72, QF72, and what happens when aircraft automation goes wrong. Qantas Flight 72 was cruising in smooth, clear air at 37,000 feet. There was no storm, no turbulence, no structural failure. Then the autopilot disconnected. The warnings started: stall, overspeed, master caution lights, Aural alerts, fault messages cascading across the cockpit. And then, without any pilot command, the Airbus A330 pitched violently nose down. Passengers who were not strapped in hit the ceiling. Cabin fittings broke. People were injured. This was not turbulence. This was an automation acting on bad data. And for a few seconds, the pilots were fighting an aircraft whose computers believed they were protecting the aircraft. I'm Richard Godfrey. Welcome to Independent Aircraft Investigations. On the 7th of October 2008, QF72 from Singapore to Perth was 3 hours into the flight, with 315 people on board. The aircraft was an Airbus A330-303, a twin-engine wide-body, registered VH-QPA. Captain Kevin Sullivan returned to the cockpit after a scheduled rest break. The first officer, Peter Lipset, then left the cockpit for a break, and the second officer, Ross, was going to occupy the right seat after a short toilet break. The aircraft became confused. Kevin was briefly alone on the flight deck during the crew changeover. The second officer had just returned and strapped in when the sequence began. This is what Kevin had to say. 2 minutes before the first pitch down, 10 systems faulted and were recorded. And then after that, it was a waterfall of failures. The stall and overspeed warnings continued once we had landed until we actually had to go into the equipment bay and pull circuit breakers to stop the warning systems. The flight warning system kept on activating. So when I talk about psycho-automation, this is it. On the 29th of October 2025, I interviewed Captain Kevin Sullivan on Daily Airline News. Kevin is a former US Navy Top Gun pilot who had moved to Australia. At the time of the accident, he had 13,592 flight hours, including 2,453 hours on the Airbus A330. Rare failure combinations still matter. The ATSB found that QF72 resulted from a combination of two things: a failure mode in one ADIRU, the Air Data Information Computer, which produced intermittent false data spikes, and a design limitation in the A330 and A340 FCPC software. The flight control algorithm was normally effective, but it could not correctly handle multiple AOA spikes from the ADIRU spaced 1.2 seconds apart. This was not a simple sensor failure. It was a system of systems accident. Bad data met a software assumption that nobody had fully exposed. The ATSB's final report, issued on the 19th of December 2011, concluded that the accident occurred due to the combination of a design limitation in the FCPC software of the Airbus A330 and A340 and a failure mode affecting one of the aircraft's three ADIRUs. The design limitation meant that in a very rare and specific situation, multiple spikes in AOA data from one of the ADIRUs could result in the FCPCs commanding the aircraft to pitch down. 42 spikes in 52 minutes were recorded by the FDR, but there were probably many more that went unrecorded. How did Kevin find the ATSB report?
It was a little bit disappointing because they didn't actually pinpoint what had happened. And when I was being briefed by them before they put it out, and I said, "You're telling me you haven't, that you can't find what exactly happened?" They, I mean, the ATSB report goes into all that investigation and experimentation, etc. But basically, there were two failures. One was in the ADIRU that was pumping out extreme values of angle of attack and labeling them as valid. So it was basically saying, I'm okay, and we're at 50 degrees angle of attack. That was being sent to the flight control computer. The flight control computer now goes, hey, that's pretty extreme. I better test it. And the algorithm in the flight control computers was also flawed. And it passed the test and said, yep, it's legit. So now I'm going to activate, in the first pitch down, two protection modes. One was for angle of attack, and the other one was for high pitch up or high Mach anti-pitch up compensation mode. And I said, what's a compensation mode? And how many are there on board? There's nothing in the manuals that says these things exist, but they do exist. And angle of attack was 4 degrees of elevator movement. The anti-pitch up compensation added another 6 degrees in summation, which again, I didn't know they could gang up and stack up and move. So we had 10 degrees of elevator movement, nose down. 14 degrees is the maximum. So at 37,000 feet at Mach decimal 82, the plane or the flight control computers commanded the tail to deflect 10 degrees. And that's enormous up there. There's a lot of energy, and that's what generated all the damage in the first pitch down.
So there were two pitch downs, and the lesson learned, redundancy is not enough if the logic is wrong. The A330 had 3 ADIRUs, and the other 2 performed normally. But the flight control logic still accepted enough of the faulty AOA data from ADIRU1 to command a pitch down. The lesson is that redundancy must be paired with robust data validation, rejection logic, and realistic failure modding. 3 sensors do not guarantee safety if the voting logic has a blind spot. There were spikes on multiple sensors, the AOA, Mach, CAS, TAT, PS1, IR1. These values cascaded through multiple systems because the downstream logic did not sufficiently reject physically implausible short-duration spikes. During the first upset, the aircraft reached 8.4 degrees nose down, recorded a peak vertical acceleration of minus zero point 0.8 g near the center of gravity, and descended 690 feet over 23 seconds. 20 seconds later, the pilots were able to return the aircraft to the assigned cruise flight level 370. The aircraft made a sudden pitch-down maneuver that was not commanded by the flight crew. It was commanded by the flight control primary computers in response to the erroneous AOA data. Less than 3 minutes later, the aircraft made a second maneuver of a similar nature, this time causing an acceleration of plus zero point 0.2 g, a 3.5-degree down angle, and a loss of altitude of 400 feet. The flight crew was able to re-establish the aircraft's assigned level in 16 seconds after that event. Automation is an aid and not a replacement for pilots. Captain Kevin Sullivan's central point is automation has effectively become a crew member. But on QF72, it became a bad crew member, one that did not explain itself, did not cooperate, and acted on data the pilots could not see. In the interview, he argues that automation should assist pilots, not replace them, and that pilots need training for complex automation and air data failures, and not only conventional failures such as an engine flameout, hydraulic failure, wind shear, or terrain events. QF72 reminds us that the pilot in command must remain the final authority, especially when the aircraft's automation is confidently wrong. One of the aircraft's 3 Air Data Inertial Reference Units, ADIRUs, started providing incorrect data to the flight computer. In response to the anomalous data, the autopilot disengaged automatically. After detailed forensic analysis of the FDR and the FCPC software and the ADIRU, the ATSB concluded that many of the data spikes were probably generated when the ADIRU CPU module combined the data value from one parameter with the label for another parameter. In practical terms, the aircraft received extreme angle of attack values that were incorrectly labeled as valid. One example examined by the ATSB was that a binary data value associated with altitude could be combined with an angle of attack label, producing an extreme AOA value that appear valid to downstream systems. The ATSB investigated QF72 as an aviation accident and described the aircraft motion as an in-flight upset. With 119 occupants injured, including 12 serious injuries, this was not merely an incident or a scare. It was an accident. Let's listen to Kevin.
Yeah, certainly a very messy and potentially it was life-threatening experience. The ATSB have classified it as an accident because of all the serious injuries to my passengers and crew. So, of course, Qantas never had an accident, but yeah, this is an accident due to the amount of injuries on board. But as you know, I'm a naval aviator, as Maverick would say, and I was trained I was trained to take off and land on aircraft carriers, and as a fighter pilot, I was trained for combat. So every time I went flying was a challenge. And every sortie I did, there was always going to be a potential for danger. And my return airfield was bobbing up and down in the middle of some ocean somewhere. So you learn very quickly, even during your training, you are trained to overload by your instructors from the first flight you ever do. Automation is a crew member now.
Yeah.
And it's got to be a good crew member, but we had a bad crew member. And this crew member was pretty psychotic, as I've described before. It wouldn't communicate with us. It wouldn't cooperate with us. Wouldn't tell us what was happening. It was looking at some other values of air data that we couldn't see. All those operations are transparent to the pilots, but the computers are communicating with each other, taking in, raw data from all the probes, digitizing it, sending it to all the user systems, and we don't see any of that.
Certification and testing must look for the unimaginable, not only the expected. The ATSB noted that the aircraft's original development process included peer reviews, system safety assessments, testing, and simulations, but none identified the FCPC AOA algorithm limitation. The report explicitly calls for more research into how engineers and safety analysts evaluate increasingly complex systems and how their tools and training and guidance can be improved. The danger was not that engineers were careless. The danger was that the system was so complex that a valid but vanishingly rare failure pattern fell outside the imagination of the safety process. A number of potential trigger types were investigated, including software bugs, software corruption, hardware faults, electromagnetic interference, and the secondary high-energy particles generated by cosmic rays that can cause a bit flip. Although a definitive conclusion could not be reached, sufficient information from multiple sources enabled the conclusion that the most of the potential trigger were very unlikely to have been involved. A much more likely scenario was that a marginal hardware weakness of some form made the unit susceptible to the effects of some type of environmental factor, which triggered the failure mode. Risk is determined by the probability of an occurrence and the potential damage if that occurrence actually happens. Mechanical failures often degrade through mechanisms engineers can model and inspect. Software and complex digital system failures can be different. The hardware may be intact, but a rare input pattern, timing condition, or data validity assumption can expose a design limitation that was never seen in testing. Pilots need training for cascading automation failures. Sullivan's interview is powerful. He describes unreliable indications, false stall and overspeed warnings, cycling ECAM messages, repeated master cautions, and an aircraft that briefly did not respond to side stick input. He also says airline training did not specifically prepare crews for these kinds of complex automation failures. We train crews for engine failures, wind shear, hydraulic failures, and terrain warnings. QF72 asks whether we train them enough for the aircraft becoming confused. Kevin's training in battle damage assessment helped him test how the crippled and vulnerable aircraft would handle at 10,000 feet before attempting a landing. Sullivan describes entering fight or flight, needing to get himself and the second officer out of the physiological fog through breathing and focus and standard operating procedures. That is a key human factors lesson. The first battle is often not with the aircraft, but with startle and overload and narrowing attention. In the first seconds of QF72, survival depended not only on skill, but on controlling the human stress response. How do you stay cool when the autopilot suddenly disconnects, the nose drops, the aircraft enters negative G, the stall and overspeed warnings sound, the cavalry charge sounds, the master warning and master caution lights illuminate, the chimes keep coming, and fault messages cascade across the ECAM. It was not immediately apparent what was happening. The aircraft generated 27 maintenance messages, but only 10 were displayed to the crew. Some repeated, some disappeared, and the ECAM became difficult to use as a diagnostic tool. Airmanship still matters in the age of fly-by-wire. Sullivan's decision to neutralize the side stick, hand-fly the aircraft, call the first officer back, assess the aircraft at altitude, divert to Learmonth, and get the aircraft on the ground shows the enduring value of manual flying, judgment, and adaptable thinking. The ATSB concluded that the crew's responses were timely and appropriate, and later described their actions as sound and professional. The aircraft was fly-by-wire, but the recovery was flown by judgment, discipline, and experience. The crew did not know whether the aircraft would pitch down again. That uncertainty drove the decision to divert to the nearest suitable airport, rather than continue to Perth. Sullivan says the crew wanted medical attention for the injured and wanted the aircraft out of the sky before it could happen again. Good decision-making is not pretending you know what the aircraft will do next. It is acting safely because you do not. Kevin devised a test procedure for the crippled aircraft on the fly. Let's listen to Kevin again.
Well, once again, this goes back to my military training. In a single engine plane, jet airplane, if it's acting up or it's flamed out, this is what we call a single engine flame out approach and landing, or a precautionary engine out landing. So we do practice that, even practice it in the Mirage for the same reasons. So that's in my toolbox of which I was rummaging around everywhere to find how am I going to, in that period, how am I going to, I was strategizing, how am I going to land this plane? And, first things first, we have flight control issues. I need to know if the plane's going to let me slow down, if the plane's going to let me extend the flaps, etc. So that doing a control check at 10,000 feet is also part of a battle damage assessment as well in my military training. So 10,000 feet, you do it just in case you can see how slow you can get before you try and land or come aboard the ship, etc. So I was setting myself up for using those two bits from my experience to set up for the type of landing I had devised, which was the engine out, single engine, the flame out approach.
The next safety lesson from QF72 is that seatbelts save lives, even in a smooth cruise. This is a public safety lesson. The aircraft was in a calm cruise. There was no turbulence. Yet at least 60 passengers were seated without seatbelts fastened. And the ATSB found the injury rate and severity were substantially greater for those not seated or seated without belts. The report's safety message is clear. Wear the belt whenever seated and keep it low and firm. QF72 was not turbulence. It was a flight control upset in clear air. And that is why the seatbelt sign is not the only warning that matters. Kevin declared a mayday and diverted to Learmonth Airport. There were 12 serious injuries and 107 minor injuries. The town and state emergency and health services responded. The Royal Flying Doctor Service and a Care Flight jet ambulance evacuated the more than 20 seriously injured to Perth. Others were treated at nearby Exmouth Hospital. Qantas sent 2 planes with medical teams and customs officers from Perth to Exmouth to help treat the injured people and fly those not hurt back to Perth. People who did not want to fly that night were provided with accommodations in Exmouth. The industry must also be careful about reducing crew because automation usually works. Sullivan links QF72 to the broader debate about reduced crew or single pilot cruise operations. His concern is that automation is being treated as a substitute for a human crew member, even though automation can fail in complex and cascading and opaque ways. Before we remove pilots because automation works 99.999% of the time, QF72 asks, who handles the remaining fraction? The ATSB identified 3 known occurrences of the LTN-101 data spike failure mode. One in September 2006, the QF72 accident in October 2008, and a further Qantas A330 occurrence in December 2008. A Jetstar VH-EBC event was also examined because it had some superficial similarities, but the ATSB concluded it was unrelated. The investigators examined many possible triggers: software faults or corruption, hardware faults, electromagnetic interference, passenger electronic devices, environmental factors, and a single event effect caused by high-energy particles. Most of these proposed triggers were assessed as unlikely. A single event effect could not be ruled out or ruled in. The ATSB's conclusion was more cautious. There was insufficient evidence to determine whether a single event effect caused the failure. So what is our conclusion? QF72 teaches that modern aircraft are extraordinarily safe, but their safety depends on more than redundancy and automation. QF72 is a reminder that aviation safety is not created by automation alone. Aviation safety is created by automation that fails safely, pilots who are trained to handle confusion, and passengers who keep their seatbelts fastened even when the sky is smooth. I've included a link in the description below the video. Just click on the More button to the episode of Daily Airline News with the full interview with Captain Kevin Sullivan. It was episode 255. Next week, I will be publishing a special tribute to Geoffrey Thomas. I will be joined by Captain Richard de Crespigny of QF32 fame, Mark Stewart, the man behind the Spirit of Douglas, Captain Al Francis, formerly with TWA, Duncan Robb from the Daily Airline News viewer community, and with messages from members of the MH370 Action Group, which was founded by Geoffrey. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to ensure this work continues.